Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're going to explore a story that unfolded quietly in the rural landscape of Central Florida. A story about a man who loved airplanes and his children. A marriage that slowly fractured and a mystery that would remain buried for years beneath concrete and careful lies. This is the story of Michael Shaver. Let yourself settle in. Get comfortable. This story moves at its own pace. With room to breathe. Room to think. There's no rush here. Just the slow unfolding of events that happened in a small town called Clermont, where the secrets were as deep as the Florida soil. Michael Douglas Shaver was born on January 14th, 1982 in upstate New York. He grew up in Utica, a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone, where winters were harsh and summers were brief. He had a brother named Brian, and a sister named Stacy, and they were a close family, the kind where Sunday dinners mattered and holidays meant something. From an early age, Michael showed an aptitude for mechanical things. He understood how systems worked, how pieces fit together to create something greater than themselves. This talent would serve him well throughout his life, leading him eventually to the place where he felt most alive, around airplanes. But before airplanes, there was Lori. They met in middle school. Two kids from the same small-town world. Their friendship turned into young love, the kind that feels eternal when you're young. When the future stretches out like an endless runway, they dated for years, their relationship deepening as they moved from adolescence into adulthood. Eventually, Michael and Lori married. And like many young couples looking for a fresh start, for warmer weather and new opportunities, they left upstate New York behind and moved to Florida. They settled in Clermont, a town in Lake County not far from Orlando. They bought a 5-acre property on Sandy Pines Road, a rural piece of land where the neighbors weren't too close, where you could hear the crickets at night and feel like you had space to breathe. The property became their home. They had 2 children together, a daughter and a son. Michael found work at Walt Disney World as a monorail technician. Day after day, he maintained the iconic transportation system that carried thousands of guests through the Magic Kingdom. It was skilled work, technical work, the kind of work that suited his mechanical mind. But his real passion, the thing that made his sister Stacy say he was in a whole different zone, was his involvement with a local flight team called Precious Metal. These weren't commercial jets or small Cessna, this was air racing. Speed and precision, and the thrill of pushing aircraft to their limits. Michael worked tirelessly in the pits, maintaining systems, solving problems, his hands always busy, always working toward the next race. His teammates described him as somewhat quiet, a man with a great sense of humor who didn't seek the spotlight but who showed up reliably, who did the work, who cared deeply about getting things right. They also said he had an undying sense of love and duty toward his 2 children. This was important to Michael. His kids were everything. Lori, meanwhile, worked from home for an insurance company. She was the one who was there day to day, managing the household, raising the children on those 5 acres while Michael went to Disney World, while he traveled to air races around the country. From the outside, it might have looked like a good life. A family, a home, work and passion and children. But beneath the surface, something was fracturing. No one can say exactly when a marriage starts to fail. Maybe it's a gradual thing, a slow accumulation of small disappointments and unmet needs. Maybe it's sudden, a single moment that changes everything. For Michael and Lori Shaver, it seems to have been both. By 2014, There were visible signs of trouble. That September, there was an incident, a fight. The details were murky, as they often are in domestic disputes, but it resulted in Michael being charged with battery. Both Michael and Lori gave conflicting stories about what happened. Each accused the other of brandishing a gun during the altercation, each claiming they had to wrestle the weapon away from the other. Michael entered a pre-trial intervention program, the kind of probation that allows first-time offenders to avoid a conviction if they complete certain requirements. He finished the program in just 6 months, half the usual time, and the charge was dismissed. But the incident had happened. The violence had occurred, and it wouldn't be the last time. Around this time, something else was happening. Michael's coworkers at Disney World began to notice things. There were days when Michael would come to work with bruises on his face, on his arms, on his chest. When asked about them, his explanations were vague or dismissive, but the bruises kept appearing. Then there was the restraining order. In 2014, Lori filed for a restraining order against Michael. The details of what she alleged were serious enough for the court to consider the petition. But then, shortly after filing it, Lori filed another motion to terminate the order. It went away as quickly as it had appeared. Michael's marriage was unraveling. For a time, he moved out of the house entirely. He went to live in an airplane hangar at work, sleeping among the tools and machinery he understood so well. During this separation, he began dating a coworker. For a while, it seemed like he might be building a new life. But Lori wasn't ready to let go. She began reporting the relationship to human resources at Disney World. The pressure mounted. The relationship with his coworker ended. In May of 2015, Michael moved back home to Lori and the children. He had been gone, and now he was back. But things were not the same. Things would never be the same again. The first week of November, 2015, started like many others. The weather in Central Florida was beginning to cool slightly, the oppressive summer heat finally relenting. On November 7th, a Saturday, there was a local tractor show. These were the kinds of community events that brought people together in rural areas like Claremont. A chance to see farm equipment, to talk with neighbors, to spend a day outdoors. Michael attended the tractor show with his family and his coworker, Frank Merritt. Frank noticed something that day. There was tension between Michael and Lori. You could see it in their body language, hear it in their voices. They weren't openly fighting, but the atmosphere was charged. Lori left the show early. Frank thought little of it at the time. Couples have their rough patches. He'd seen Michael and Lori go through difficulties before. He didn't know that this would be the last time he would ever see Michael Shaver alive. The following Monday, November 9th, Michael didn't show up for work. This was unusual. Michael was reliable, the kind of employee who showed up on time, who did his job without complaint. Frank tried to reach him. Nothing. Tuesday, November 10th. Still no Michael. No call, no explanation. This was now officially strange. Frank reached out again, this time through text message. Finally, a response came from Michael's phone. The message said that Michael was quitting his job. He needed to save his marriage, the text explained. He told them to keep his expensive aircraft mechanic tools. He didn't want them anymore. Frank found this deeply odd. Those tools were Michael's pride, worth thousands of dollars. Collected over years of work. Michael would never just abandon them. But what could Frank do? The message had come from Michael's phone. Maybe the marriage troubles had gotten worse. Maybe Michael needed to make a dramatic gesture. Frank wasn't the only one receiving strange messages. Over the following days and weeks, friends and family members began hearing from Michael through text messages and Facebook. The messages all had a similar theme. Leave me alone. I don't have family anymore. Don't contact me. Everyone just needs to leave me alone. Michael's mother received messages. His brother Brian heard from him through text. Old friends got cold, dismissive notes that seemed completely out of character. Michael Shaver, the man who loved his children with undying devotion, was apparently telling everyone to stay away, to his coworkers and friends. This didn't add up. Michael had his problems, sure, but abandoning his children, cutting off all contact with his family, giving away his tools and just disappearing, it didn't fit the man they knew. Lori, meanwhile, had her own story. When Frank Merritt visited the house to check on Michael, Lori told him that Michael had left. Just left. He was there one moment, gone the next. No goodbye. She said she had no idea where he went. The story began to change depending on who asked. To some people, Lori said Michael had moved to Georgia. To others, he was in New York. Or maybe California. One version had him in jail for non-payment of child support, which wasn't true. She told her new boyfriend's mother that Michael was a pilot who traveled frequently. She told her supervisor at work that he was incarcerated. To some friends, she even claimed that Michael was stalking her. This was particularly strange, since no one had physically seen Michael in months. How could he be stalking her if no one knew where he was? But life went on. Weeks turned into months. The text messages from Michael's phone continued, though they became less frequent. No one saw him. No one spoke to him on the phone. Only texts. Only Facebook messages. Always the same theme. Leave me alone. And on that 5-acre property on Sandy Pines Road, something else was happening. Something that neighbors would only understand later. When all the pieces finally came together. Grief and suspicion often move at different speeds. For Michael's friends and family, the first months of his absence were confusing. The messages seemed to come from him. After all, maybe he really had left. Maybe the marriage had broken him. Maybe he needed space. But as 2016 rolled on, the confusion started hardening into suspicion. Nobody had seen Michael. Not once. Not a single in-person sighting since that day at the tractor show in November 2015. His bank accounts showed no activity after late 2015. No withdrawals, no purchases, nothing. For a man who had to eat, who had to live somewhere, who had to buy gas and food and clothing, this was impossible. Yet Michael's phone and Facebook account remained active. Messages continued to be sent. Someone was still using those accounts. Someone who knew Michael's passwords, who had access to his devices. During this time, Lori's life was changing rapidly. She had begun dating someone new, a man named Jerame Townsend. He was a married veteran, and their relationship began sometime in late 2015 or early 2016. They met at a park where their sons were playing together. Jerame was having marital problems. Lori told him she was divorced. They started seeing each other. This relationship would be brief, and would end in a peculiar way. One day in 2016, Jerame's wife, Vanessa Townsend, received a flower delivery at her home. There was a note attached. It read, "Roses are red, violets are blue. My wife is a whore. Your husband is too. Sorry about this. Check your Facebook message. We need to talk. Mike." The flowers were supposedly from Michael Shaver, but investigators would later discover they were paid for through Lori Shaver's bank account. The note was allegedly written to expose the affair between Lori and Jerame. Vanessa was devastated. The affair was revealed. The relationship between Lori and Jerame ended abruptly. But the more significant question was, why would Michael Shaver, who had supposedly left his family and wanted nothing to do with anyone, care enough to send flowers exposing his wife's affair? It was another piece that didn't fit. Around March of 2016, Lori began a construction project in her backyard. She built a fire pit. It was a substantial structure, the kind of outdoor feature that required digging, foundation work, and careful planning. The fire pit went up on a particular spot in the yard, near where the property stretched out toward the trees. Then in September of 2016, Lori poured a concrete slab near that fire pit. She posted pictures of it on her Facebook page. In the wet concrete, she and her new boyfriend, Travis Filmer, etched their initials. Travis had begun dating Lori sometime after the relationship with Jerame ended. He was a different kind of partner, someone who would eventually become her husband. The concrete slab settled. The fire pit became a feature of the property. Life continued. And beneath that concrete, something remained hidden. Something that had been there since November 2015. Something that wouldn't be discovered for another year and a half. By February 2018, more than 2 years had passed since anyone had physically seen Michael Shaver. 2 years of text messages that seemed wrong. 2 years of excuses and changing stories. 2 years of radio silence from a man who supposedly loved his children above all else. Scott Amatocchio had been Michael's friend since childhood. They'd grown up together in upstate New York. Two boys who became men, who stayed in touch even after Michael moved to Florida. Scott knew Michael. He knew what kind of man he was, what kind of father he was, and something about Michael's disappearance didn't sit right with him. Scott began reaching out to other people who knew Michael. The co-workers, the friends, the family members. Everyone had the same story. Strange text messages. No actual contact. Vague explanations from Lori about Michael's whereabouts. The more Scott investigated, the more convinced he became that something was very wrong. On February 16, 2018, Scott contacted the Lake County Sheriff's Office and requested a welfare check on Michael Shaver. He explained the totality of the circumstances, the sudden disappearance, the out-of-character messages, the lack of any financial activity, the conflicting stories from Lori, the fact that Michael's possessions were still at the house even though he supposedly left. Deputies arrived at the Shaver property on Sandy Pines Road. It was a sprawling 5-acre lot with the house set back from the road. Trees and space and privacy all around. Lori answered the door. The deputies asked about Michael. Lori told them he had left. He had driven away in a black SUV. She hadn't seen him since 2015. She didn't know where he was. Georgia, maybe. Or New York. She'd heard different things. Lori initially cooperated with the deputies. She gave them permission to look around the property. They walked the grounds, noting the layout, the outbuildings, the fire pit in the backyard with its concrete slab. And that's when they noticed something. There was a depression in the concrete slab, not a crack. Exactly. More like a settled area. It was rectangular in shape, about 6 feet by 3 feet. The kind of dimensions that might suggest a large object had been buried beneath the concrete before it was poured, causing it to sink slightly over time. The deputies asked Lori if they could bring in a cadaver dog to check the area. Just to be thorough. Just to rule things out. Lori's demeanor changed. She stopped cooperating. She told them to leave her property. She contacted a lawyer. The door closed. Literally and figuratively. The deputies knew they needed more than permission. Now, they needed a warrant. They began the process of building their case, documenting everything Scott had told them, everything they'd observed, all the inconsistencies in Lori's story. In March of 2018, they returned with that warrant. They brought excavation equipment. They brought cadaver dogs. They brought the tools necessary to break through concrete and dig into the Florida soil. The cadaver dogs alerted immediately at the fire pit. The depression in the concrete wasn't just settling. It was something else. The excavation began. The concrete was broken up and removed. The digging went deeper, 3 feet down into the earth, beneath where the fire pit stood. The soil gave up its secret, human remains. Skeletal, wrapped in a bed sheet that would later be traced to a purchase from Kohl's that matched Lori Shaver's bank records. The remains were incomplete, deteriorated from years in the ground, but they were unmistakably human. And there was something else. On the skull there was a defect. A hole. The kind of hole made by a bullet entering from behind. The medical examiner would later confirm what the investigators already suspected. These were the remains of Michael Douglas Shaver. Cause of death, a gunshot wound to the back of the head. He had been shot once, execution style, and buried in his own backyard. Michael Shaver hadn't left his family. He hadn't abandoned his children. He hadn't been sending those messages. He had been dead the entire time, buried beneath the place where his wife would eventually marry another man, beneath the fire pit where they might have roasted marshmallows or gathered with friends. He'd been there all along, beneath the concrete, beneath the lies, waiting to be found. The discovery of Michael Shaver's remains transformed everything. What had been a missing person case was now a homicide investigation. The Lake County Sheriff's Office had a body, a cause of death, and a primary suspect. From the beginning, investigators focused on Lori Shaver. The evidence pointed to her consistently and overwhelmingly. She had been the only adult living on the property when Michael disappeared. She had given constantly changing stories about his whereabouts. She had access to his phone and Facebook accounts. She had built a fire pit and poured concrete directly over his burial site. But investigators needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed to understand the timeline, to document the deception, to build a case that would hold up in court. The timeline began to emerge through painstaking work. Michael was last seen alive on November 7th, 2015, at the tractor show. November 10th was the first day he failed to show up for work. Somewhere in that narrow window, he was killed. Investigators examined the messages sent from Michael's phone and Facebook account. Hundreds of texts and posts, all sent after his death, all designed to make people believe he was still alive. The messages told friends and family to leave him alone, that he didn't have family anymore, that he wanted to be left in peace. They were carefully crafted to prevent anyone from looking for him, from visiting, from verifying that he was actually alive. The financial records painted another picture. After Michael's death, someone continued to use his debit and credit cards. The purchases were revealing women's lingerie from Wish.com, items for children from Walmart online. Loans were taken out in Michael's name. Money was withdrawn from ATMs until his accounts were overdrawn. Lori also began selling off Michael's possessions. His tools worth thousands of dollars, 1,000 guns, his Ford truck, the family tractor, even, eventually, the family home itself. Everything Michael had worked for, everything he'd accumulated, was liquidated piece by piece. Investigators also learned about the relationships Lori had begun shortly after Michael's death. First, Jeremy Townsend, the married veteran she'd met at the park. Then Travis Filmer, who became her boyfriend and eventually her husband. In fact, Lori and Travis got married on the very property where Michael was buried, in the backyard above his remains, just over a year before his body was discovered. Travis would later tell investigators something chilling. He said that Lori had once told him something bad happened. He claimed she admitted there was a body on the property. He said she'd told him, "It's not that he's missing, he's no longer walking the earth." Yet Travis never reported this to police. He married Lori anyway. He lived in the house with her and her children, knowing, or at least suspecting, what lay beneath the concrete in the backyard. The investigation took time. Detectives had to interview dozens of witnesses, trace hundreds of digital communications, follow paper trails through banks and online retailers. They had to build a timeline that accounted for every day of Michael's absence, and every lie told to cover it up. It wasn't until September 17th, 2020, more than 2 years after the discovery of Michael's body, that Lori Shaver was finally arrested. She was charged with second-degree murder and accessory after the fact. She entered a plea of not guilty to all charges. She posted $50,000 bail and returned home to her children to await trial. The case would take 4 more years to get to court. 4 years of legal maneuvering, motions, delays. 4 years while Michael's family waited for justice. 4 years while Lori maintained her innocence. And then in the months before trial, the defense dropped a bombshell that no one saw coming. In May of 2023, Lori Shaver's defense attorney filed a motion with the court. The motion contained a shocking claim. A minor child had confessed to committing the murder. That minor child was now 14 years old. At the time of Michael's death, she would have been 7. The child was Lori and Michael's daughter, Isabel. According to the defense motion, Isabel had met multiple times with her court-appointed attorney. She had expressed a desire to testify in her mother's trial. She had been informed of the rights she would be waiving and the possible penalties she could face by confessing to a crime. Yet she persisted in her desire to testify. The defense claimed that Isabel had acted as a consequence of past and repeated violence within the residence by Michael Shaver. They painted a picture of an abusive father and a frightened child who acted to protect her mother. The motion added another layer to the story. The defense also claimed that after Isabel shot her father, Jeremy Townsend, Lori's boyfriend at the time, had happened upon the scene, taken the gun from the child's hands, and fired a second shot at Michael Shaver before disposing of the body. This version of events would become the centerpiece of the defense strategy. A 7-year-old girl protecting her mother from an abusive husband, a boyfriend who finished what the child started, a mother caught in an impossible situation, forced to cover up a tragedy she hadn't committed. The prosecution, however, saw things very differently. They argued that the defense's story made no sense. The medical examiner had found only 1 gunshot wound to Michael's skull. There was no evidence of a second bullet. If Jeremy Townsend had fired a second shot, where did it go? Moreover, investigators had interviewed Townsend extensively. He denied any involvement in Michael's death. He said he had never met Michael, had never been to the house during the time frame when Michael was killed. He testified that Lori told him she was divorced, that Michael had left with a friend in a vehicle. Prosecutors also noted that Isabel's story had changed multiple times over the years. The consistency problems, they argued, suggested coaching or fabrication, and the timeline was problematic. The defense claimed Michael was killed in May of 2016, 6 months after he actually died, according to all other evidence. As the trial date approached in September of 2024, the battle lines were drawn. The defense would argue that Lori was innocent, that her daughter and her ex-boyfriend were responsible. The prosecution would argue that Lori acted alone, that she killed her husband and then spent years pretending to be him to cover her tracks. The trial would be dramatic, emotional, and full of unexpected moments. But before we get there, it's worth pausing to consider the impossible position this case put everyone in. If the defense was telling the truth, then a 7-year-old girl had killed her father and lived with that knowledge for nearly 9 years. A mother had covered up the crime to protect her child, sacrificing her own freedom. A boyfriend had been involved in disposing of a body and had lied about it for years. If the prosecution was telling the truth, then a mother had killed her husband, buried him in the backyard, and was now prepared to let her teenage daughter falsely confess to murder to save her. Either way, the tragedy was unfathomable. Either way, Michael Shaver was still dead, still buried beneath concrete for years while his family searched for him. Either way, there were no winners. The trial of Lori Shaver began on September 9th, 2024, in Lake County, Florida, nearly 9 years after Michael's death. Nearly 6.5 years after the discovery of his body, the case would finally be heard by a jury of 6 people who would decide Lori's fate. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. They called 15 witnesses over the course of several days. Michael's co-workers from Disney World testified about his character, his devotion to his children, his reliability. They described how out of character it was for him to quit his job suddenly, to abandon his expensive tools. Family members testified about the strange text messages, the vague explanations from Lori, the years of not knowing what happened to Michael. Brian Shaver, Michael's brother, spoke about how his mother had gotten sick, and they couldn't reach Michael to tell him. The pain in his voice was evident. Friends like Scott Mituccio explained why they became suspicious, why they ultimately contacted law enforcement. Frank Merritt described the last day he saw Michael alive, the tension at the tractor show, the text message that came days later saying Michael was quitting. Law enforcement testified about the welfare check, the suspicious concrete slab, the excavation that revealed Michael's remains. Corporal Corey Anderson described the depression in the concrete, how it was approximately 6 feet by 3 feet and 8 inches deep, the size and shape of a grave. The medical examiner presented the forensic evidence. 1 gunshot wound to the back of the head. No evidence of a second bullet. The remains had been in the ground for years, wrapped in a sheet that matched purchases from Lori's bank accounts. Digital forensics experts traced the messages sent from Michael's accounts after his death. They showed how someone had impersonated him for more than 2 years, maintaining the fiction that he was alive. The messages all came from devices and locations associated with Lori. Financial experts detailed how Michael's accounts were drained, how his possessions were sold, how loans were taken out in his name. Every transaction pointed back to Lori. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculated murder and an elaborate cover-up. They argued that Lori had shot Michael, buried him in the backyard, and then spent years pretending to be him to prevent anyone from looking too closely. When she finally moved on with her life, dating new men and eventually remarrying, she did so literally on top of her husband's grave. Then came the defense's turn, and it was here that the trial took its most dramatic turn. On September 12th, Isabel Shaver took the witness stand. She was 15 years old now, just 2 days away from her 16th birthday. Her mother sat at the defense table, watching. The courtroom was silent. Lori's defense attorney, Jeffrey Wiggs, asked Isabel directly, "Do you know anything about the death of your father?" Isabel's answer would stun the courtroom. She described a violent confrontation she claimed to have witnessed when she was 7 years old. She said it happened on the back porch of their 5-acre property. She said she heard her mother screaming for help. "I went to my mom's room. Sibel testified and went to her end table. I grabbed her gun. I went back out and I went to the door, and I shot him. She described her relationship with her father as poor. She said there were arguments daily, violence several times per month. She said her mother was always the one who was hurt, that Michael didn't have a significant relationship with his children. Under questioning, Isabel elaborated on the defense's theory. After she shot her father, Jeremy Townsend arrived at the scene. He took the gun from her hands and fired a second shot. He told Lori to take the children away, that he would take care of it. He disposed of Michael's body while they were gone. It was a powerful testimony, delivered by a teenager who had lived with this alleged secret for most of her life. Isabel described her mother as her best friend. She seemed determined to protect Lori, to take responsibility for what happened, but the prosecution wasn't convinced. They pointed out the inconsistencies. The changing timeline that put Michael's death in May 2016 instead of November 2015. The claim of a second shot when the medical examiner found only one bullet wound. The fact that Jeremy Townsend denied ever meeting Michael, much less shooting him. The next day, Lori herself took the stand. She echoed her daughter's story, adding details about her allegedly abusive relationship with Michael. She described trying to leave him multiple times. She said, "I should have learned my lesson then, but I didn't." Lori struggled when prosecutors pressed her on the details. If Michael was killed in May 2016, as she claimed, where was he for the previous 6 months? How did he collect his mail? How did he handle his finances? Lori said she took his mail to the post office, that she didn't have communication with him, that she wasn't aware of the details of his life. She also claimed she didn't know her husband's body was buried under the concrete slab she poured. She said she chose that location because the area had already been cleared and leveled. When neighbors reported a foul smell coming from the property between November and spring, she attributed it to dogs attacking her piglets. Jeremy Townsend testified for the prosecution, flatly denying the defense's accusations. "I did not know who Mike was," he stated clearly. He had never been to the house during the relevant time frame. He had never met Michael Shaver. He had certainly never shot him or helped dispose of his body. In their closing arguments, prosecutors emphasized the timeline and the evidence. They argued that all the physical evidence, all the digital evidence, all the financial evidence pointed to one person and one person only, Lori Shaver. They reminded the jury that Lori's husband was buried in her own backyard, under a concrete slab she had poured, on property where she was the only adult present when he died. The defense argued that the state's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. No one had actually witnessed Lori killing Michael. The defense insisted that Isabel's testimony should be believed, that she was a child acting to protect her mother from violence. After nearly a week of testimony, the case went to the jury on Friday, September 13th, 2024. The 6 jurors deliberated for approximately 4 hours. When they returned, Lori Shaver could barely look at them. Her face was tense, composure fragile. The verdict: guilty of second-degree murder, not guilty of accessory after the fact. Lori Shaver visibly struggled to maintain her composure as the verdict was read. She was immediately remanded to the custody of the Lake County Sheriff's Office to await sentencing. The jury had not believed the defense's story. They had concluded that Lori, not her daughter, not her ex-boyfriend, had killed Michael Shaver. The sentencing hearing was held on November 26, 2024. Judge Carrie F. Rada presided over the proceedings in a Tavares courtroom. The gallery was filled with Michael's family members, friends and members of the press who had followed the case for years. Brian Shaver, Michael's brother, addressed the court. His words were measured but heavy with grief. He spoke about the immeasurable void Lori's actions had left in their lives. "While justice may offer some solace," he said, "it will not restore the wounds." 2 of Michael's friends had written impact statements that were read aloud by the state attorney's office. One letter pleaded with the judge to ensure Lori never returned to society. It described her actions as inhuman, ruthless, and savage. It noted her lack of any repentance and predicted she would again incite bedlam and turmoil with whomever she associates. Lori did not speak at the sentencing, but she submitted a 14-page letter to the state attorney's office. In it, she continued to maintain her innocence and accused her ex-boyfriend of the murder. She did not apologize. She did not express remorse for Michael's death or for the years of pain his family endured. Judge Rada announced the sentence. Life in prison. Lori Shaver, now 41 years old, would spend the rest of her life behind bars for the murder of Michael Douglas Shaver. There would be no parole, no possibility of release. The woman who had built a fire pit over her husband's grave, who had married another man on top of his burial site, who had pretended to be him for years to cover her tracks, would never be free again. Bill Gladson, the 5th Judicial Circuit State Attorney, released a statement. We hope the defendant's life sentence brings some measure of closure and peace to the victim's loved ones. Michael's family issued their own statement. It read, in part, it's been an extremely hard journey. There hasn't been a day that we have not thought of Michael, and there has not been a day that has gone by that we have not stopped looking for Michael. On behalf of the entire Shaver family, we are very grateful to be standing here today to recognize the guilty verdict against Lori. While this will not bring our beloved Michael back, our family can finally, after all these years, start to get closure. The statement ended with gratitude for the Lake County law enforcement officers and investigators who had worked tirelessly to solve the case and bring justice for Michael. Lori's defense attorney announced immediately after the verdict that his client would be filing an appeal. As of now, that appeal process continues, but questions remain, particularly about Isabel. During the trial, prosecutors accused Isabel of changing her statements multiple times. They suggested she had been coached to testify falsely. Some legal experts have speculated that Isabel could potentially face perjury charges for her testimony. She is now 16 years old. She testified under oath that she killed her father. If that testimony was false, if she lied to protect her mother, she could face serious legal consequences. As of now, no charges have been filed against Isabel. The Lake County Sheriff's Office and the State Attorney's Office have not indicated whether they intend to pursue such charges. It's a delicate situation. She's a teenager who has already lost her father and now her mother. She's been caught in the middle of a murder case for most of her life. Whether she genuinely believes she killed her father, whether she was coerced into saying so, or whether she made a calculated decision to try to save her mother remains unknown. Tonight's story ends where it began, on that 5-acre property in Clermont, Florida. The house still stands, though it's under new ownership now. The fire pit has been dismantled. The concrete slab is gone. The earth has been turned over, examined, documented as evidence. But the place remembers. This is the nature of true crime. It's not just about the spectacular moment of violence, the dramatic revelation, the courtroom verdict. It's about the quiet aftermath. It's about the family members who go on living with an absence they can never fill. It's about the children who grow up knowing what happened in their own backyard. It's about the ordinary places that become monuments to tragedy. Michael Shaver was 36 years old when he died. He never saw his children grow up. He never got to work on another airplane. Never felt the satisfaction of watching precious metal race. His life was cut short on a November day in 2015 by someone he trusted, someone he'd built a life with, someone who shared his home. For more than 2 years, he existed in a strange limbo, officially missing but actually dead. Still sending messages, still active on social media, still making purchases, still part of the world he'd already left. It was a ghostly existence, maintained through deception, sustained by someone who wanted everyone to believe he'd simply walked away. The truth, when it finally emerged from beneath the concrete, was both simpler and more horrifying than anyone imagined. He hadn't left. He'd been there all along, in the place he'd called home, beneath the soil he'd once walked on, waiting for someone to care enough to look. Scott Amatuccio cared enough. The Lake County Sheriff's Office cared enough. Michael's family, his brother Brian, his mother who got sick without him knowing, his sister Stacy who'd watched him work on airplanes with such focus and dedication. They all cared enough to keep asking questions when the answers didn't make sense. And now, 9 years after his death, there is at least resolution. Not closure exactly. You don't get closure when someone you love is murdered and buried in a backyard. A resolution, a verdict, a sentence, an acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. That justice, however delayed, matters. Michael's family can visit his grave now. They know where he is. They don't have to wonder anymore if he's alive somewhere. If he'll call, if he'll come home. The wondering is over. The not knowing has ended. Lori Shaver will spend the rest of her life in prison, thinking about the choices she made, the lies she told, the life she took, whether she experiences remorse, whether she ever admits what really happened, whether she understands the magnitude of what she did. We may never know. Some people never do. And somewhere, perhaps, there are still unanswered questions. Why did it happen? What was the final argument about? Was it premeditated or spontaneous? Did Michael know in his last moments what was about to happen? These details may never be fully known. The only two people who were definitely there that day are Michael, who is gone, and Lori, who maintains her innocence. But the central truth is clear and immutable. Michael Shaver is dead. His life mattered. He was loved. He is missed, and the person responsible for his death is being held accountable. In the end, that's what justice looks like. Imperfect, delayed, complicated by lies and conflicting testimonies and family trauma. But justice nonetheless. The soil of that 5-acre property has given up its secret. The silence has been broken. The truth, as it always does eventually, has come to light. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey together through a story that speaks to the fragility of life, the hidden struggles behind closed doors, and the dreams of a young woman who crossed borders seeking hope. These stories are told softly, with care and respect for those involved. It unfolds slowly in the measured pace of evening conversation. There are no sudden sounds here, no jarring moments, just a narrative, steady and calm, meant to accompany you as you drift towards sleep. Tonight, we remember Angie Diaz, a name that might be unfamiliar to many, but whose story carries lessons about domestic violence, immigration, sacrifice, and the sometimes invisible warning signs that precede tragedy. This is the story of a 21-year-old woman whose life ended far too soon in Waller County, Texas, on a winter day in January 2023. To understand what happened, we must first understand who Angie Diaz was. Not just a victim, not just a headline, but a person with dreams and ambitions, with family she loved, and a future she was building one paycheck at a time. Yanja Daniela Diaz Rivera was born in Nicaragua. She grew up in the town of El Viejo, in the department of Chinandega, a place where the landscape is marked by volcanic soil and close-knit communities. She was the eldest of 4 siblings, a position that often comes with responsibility and expectation. Those who knew her from her childhood days described her as bright, full of energy, someone whose laughter could fill a room. She graduated from Colegio José del Arguello, her local high school, with plans that many young people harbor, the desire for education, for opportunity, for a life beyond what circumstances provided. But opportunity, in Nicaragua, was not always easy to find. And so Angie, like countless others before her, made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. At 18 years old, shortly after finishing high school, she left Nicaragua. She traveled north with a cousin, making her way to the United States, to Texas specifically, where family already lived. Her mother, Dania Diaz, had fled Nicaragua herself several years earlier, escaping a violent relationship. Now Angie would reunite with her. The journey immigrants make is rarely simple. It involves leaving behind everything familiar: language, culture, the comfort of known streets and faces. Angie settled in Texas, moving in initially with an aunt who became like a second mother to her. And she did what so many immigrants do upon arrival. She worked. Angie found employment at Chepe's Meat Market, a local establishment that served as both butcher shop and taqueria. It was honest work, the kind that requires early mornings and physical stamina. She worked there for more than 3 years, becoming a familiar face to customers and colleagues alike. Her boss, Veronica Jimenez, would later describe her as a ray of sunshine, someone who arrived each day with infectious energy and a smile that seemed impossible to dim. But Angie worked more than one job, because there was a reason for all this labor, a purpose that drove her through long shifts and tired evenings. Back in Nicaragua, her aunt, the woman who had helped raise her, who she considered a second mother, was battling cancer. The treatments were expensive. The family needed help, and so Angie worked, sending money home whenever she could, carrying the weight of responsibility that many eldest children know well. She was also building something for herself. Angie had developed a passion for fitness and health. She became a fitness coach, something she was immensely proud of. On social media, she shared her journey of transformation, posting about exercise routines, healthy eating, the importance of self-love and confidence. In one post from November, she celebrated losing weight through dedication and discipline. Always positive but more in love with myself, she wrote. With high self-esteem and many dreams to fulfill. If I could do it, you can too. What are you waiting for? She was studying to become an accountant as well, adding education to her already full schedule. At 21 years old, Angie Diaz was juggling multiple jobs, sending money to family, pursuing fitness goals, and planning for a professional future. She was by all accounts building the kind of life she had dreamed of when she left Nicaragua. And then she met someone. His name was Jared James Decas. Like Angie, he was 21 years old. He had grown up in Waller County in a suburban environment, living with his parents. In high school, he had played football and wrestled. After graduation, he became an electrician, working with his hands, earning a living in the trades. He worked at the same meat market where Angie was employed. It was there, among the daily rhythms of customer orders and restocking shelves, that they met. To those who observed them together, they seemed happy. A young couple, both working hard, both navigating the challenges of early adulthood. Neighbors who knew Jared would later say he seemed protective of those he loved. Angie's co-workers saw a young woman in love, excited about her relationship, talking about her boyfriend with the kind of enthusiasm that marks new romance. In October of 2022, Jared and Angie married. The ceremony took place at the Waller County Courthouse. The officiant was Judge Trey Duhan, who would later post a photograph of the smiling couple on Facebook, commenting that during his short time with them, they had seemed like a very nice young couple. Angie turned 21 that same month. It was, by all outward appearances, a happy beginning. After the wedding, Angie and Jared moved into a small cabin, located behind the main house on Jared's parents' property on Oak Hollow Boulevard, in a rural area near Magnolia, Texas. The arrangement was practical. It gave the young couple their own space while keeping family nearby. The property was quiet, removed from the bustle of Houston, which lay about 45 miles to the southeast. But something changed after the wedding. Those who knew Angie began to notice subtle differences. Her boss, Veronica Jimenez, observed that while Angie was still happy, still bright, and full of energy, there were days when she seemed different, tired, withdrawn. She was happy, very happy with her husband, Jimenez would later tell reporters. But there were days when she was different. She was tired. But I wasn't sure if she was tired because of her job or because of her relationship. My friends noticed it too. Something wasn't quite right, though they couldn't put their finger on what exactly. The concern was vague, the kind that makes you wonder but not act. Looking back, with the clarity that only hindsight provides, they would wonder if they had missed something important, if there were signs they should have recognized. There had been calls to the authorities. Sheriff's deputies had responded to the home on Oak Hollow more than once for reports of disturbances, for domestic disputes, but nothing that rose to what law enforcement would later describe as this level of violence. The incidents were logged, recorded, but did not predict what was coming. 2 months before the murder, in November of 2022, Jared was arrested on a charge of driving while intoxicated. Court records from that arrest reveal concerning behavior. He threatened a police officer. He threatened staff at the Montgomery County Jail. His aggression escalated to the point where he punched windows, and officers were forced to place him in a restraint chair. It was a glimpse of something volatile beneath the surface. something that those who only knew him casually might never have suspected. Meanwhile, Angie continued working. She continued posting on social media about fitness and positivity. She continued sending money to her aunt in Nicaragua. She continued living what appeared from the outside to be a normal life. And then came January 11th, 2023. It was a Wednesday, a winter day in Texas. The kind where the temperature hovers somewhere between cool and mild. For most people in Waller County, it was an ordinary day. They went to work, ran errands, made dinner plans, lived their lives unaware that something terrible was unfolding on Oak Hollow Boulevard. Sometime that morning, surveillance cameras captured Jared arriving at Chepe's meat market, the place where both he and Angie had worked, the place where they had met. The timestamp read approximately 11:40 in the morning. He entered the store, walked around, selected some items, drinks, perhaps other products, and then left. He did not pay. Staff would remember this detail later. This odd behavior from someone they knew. What happened next remains known only to the person who committed the act. There were no witnesses to what occurred in that small cabin behind the main house. No one heard screams. No one saw violence unfold. The details would only emerge later, pieced together by investigators from physical evidence and a confession. At approximately 4:35 that afternoon, a call came into the Waller County Sheriff's Office. The caller was Jared's father. He reported a possible death at the property on Oak Hollow Boulevard. Something had happened. Something was wrong. Deputies responded immediately, driving out to the rural property. When they arrived, they found Jared still at the scene. He had not fled. He was there, waiting, along with his parents. All of them were taken to the sheriff's department for questioning. Inside the small cabin where Angie and Jared had been living, investigators found a scene that Sheriff Troy Guidry would later describe as gruesome. The residence was covered in blood, and on the floor near the bed, they found Angie Diaz. She had been stabbed multiple times in the back. Her body had been mutilated. She had been decapitated. Her head was found in the shower. The weapon, investigators determined, was a kitchen knife. Ordinary cutlery turned into an instrument of violence. All the parts of Angie's body were recovered from the scene. Everything had happened there, in that cabin. There was no need to search elsewhere. During questioning, Jared Dickus confessed. He admitted to killing his wife. He provided details that matched what investigators had found. But when asked why, when asked for a motive, there was no clear answer. No explanation that could make sense of such brutality. No reason that could justify what had been done. Jared was arrested and charged with murder. His bond was initially set at $500,000, but prosecutors, citing the heinous nature of the crime and Jared's previous violent behavior during his arrest, petitioned for the bond to be raised. They argued that $500,000 was not sufficient. A judge agreed and increased the bond to $1 million. The judge also ordered a mental health evaluation to determine Jared's competency to stand trial. News of Angie's death spread quickly through the community. For those who knew her, it was incomprehensible. The woman who had been so full of life, so determined to build a better future, was gone, murdered by the man she had married just 3 months earlier. Her family was devastated. Angie's mother, Dania, who had herself escaped violence by fleeing Nicaragua, now faced the unimaginable loss of her daughter. She spoke to reporters, her grief evident, saying she wished Angie had spoken up if something was wrong in her marriage. But domestic violence rarely announces itself clearly. Victims often hide their suffering, held back by fear, shame, misplaced loyalty, or the hope that things will improve. The family faced another challenge. Angie's body was in Texas, but they wanted to bring her home to Nicaragua for burial. The rest of the family, including the aunt Angie had worked so hard to support, lived there. They wanted to say goodbye. The family sought help from the Nicaraguan consulate in Houston, but reported being turned away. They set up a GoFundMe page, asking for assistance with funeral costs and the expense of transporting Angie's remains. The community responded. A candlelight vigil was held on January 15th, just days after the murder. People gathered at the Oak Hollow Pavilion to remember Angie, to honor her life, to grieve together. Those who attended spoke of her kindness, her work ethic, her optimism. A memorial appeared outside Chepe's meat market, where customers and coworkers left flowers and notes. On January 24th, Angie's remains were finally transported back to Nicaragua. Her family held a funeral service there, giving their final goodbyes. The young woman who had left El Viejo years earlier seeking opportunity returned in the saddest way imaginable. The legal process moved forward. Jared Dykes remained in custody, held on a $1 million bond. Questions arose during the pre-trial phase about his mental health. His attorneys raised concerns about whether he was competent to stand trial. Was there an underlying mental illness that explained his actions? Were there psychological factors that needed to be considered? A court-ordered psychiatric examination was conducted. After evaluation, the psychiatrist determined that Jared Dykes was competent to stand trial. Whatever mental health issues might have existed, they did not prevent him from understanding the charges against him or participating in his own defense. The case would proceed. Prosecutors consulted with Angie's family about how to move forward. It was their daughter, their sister, their loved one who had been killed. Their input mattered. Together, they worked out a plea agreement rather than going to trial, which would have involved testimony, evidence, and the reliving of trauma. Jared Dykes would plead guilty in exchange for a specific sentence. On July 31st, 2024, more than a year and a half after Angie's death, Jared appeared before District Court Judge Gary Cheney. He pleaded guilty to the murder of his wife. As part of the plea deal, he waived his right to appeal. He waived any potential insanity defense. He waived any future habeas corpus petitions. He accepted full responsibility for what he had done. Judge Cheney sentenced him to 40 years in prison. He would serve that time in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Under the terms of the sentence, Jared Dykes would not be eligible for parole until the year 2043. He would be over 60 years old before he could even apply for release. District Attorney Sean Whitmore spoke about the case after sentencing. Waller County does not tolerate domestic violence, he said in a statement. Heinous crimes like this one will not go unanswered. We will seek justice for the victims of domestic violence and send a message to the perpetrators that here, we fight for our victims. The sentence brought some closure, though nothing could truly heal the wound left by Angie's death. Her family had agreed to the terms. Justice, in whatever form it could take, had been served. But Angie herself remained gone, her dreams unfulfilled, her life cut short by the person who had promised to love and protect her. The story of Angie Diaz is one that repeats itself in different forms across communities everywhere. Domestic violence remains one of the most underreported and misunderstood crimes. It happens behind closed doors, in homes that from the outside appear normal, even happy. It affects people of all backgrounds, all income levels, all nationalities, and far too often it ends in tragedy. Angie's case highlights several important factors. First, the particular vulnerability of immigrant women. Angie had left her home country, was navigating life in a new place with a different language and culture. Research shows that immigrant victims of domestic violence often face unique barriers to reporting abuse. Fear of deportation, lack of confidence in police, cultural factors, isolation from support networks. Angie may have felt she had nowhere to turn. Second, the case underscores how warning signs can be missed or minimized. There had been previous calls to law enforcement about disturbances. Friends noticed changes in Angie's demeanor. Jared had shown violent behavior during his arrest months before the murder, but none of these facts were connected into a clear picture of danger until it was too late. Domestic violence often escalates gradually, and intervention is difficult when victims hide their abuse, or when observers don't want to intrude on what seems like private matters. Third, the story reminds us that domestic violence cuts across seemingly normal relationships. To outside observers, Angie and Jared were just a young married couple. He worked as an electrician. She worked at a meat market. They lived in a cabin on family property, and nothing about their external circumstances screamed danger. And yet, within that cabin, violence erupted in the most extreme form. The role of mental health in cases like this remains complex. Questions were raised about Jared's mental state, but he was ultimately deemed competent. Many people commit domestic violence without any diagnosable mental illness. Violence is a choice, even if that choice is influenced by psychological factors, substance use, or learned patterns of behavior. Addressing domestic violence requires both holding perpetrators accountable and examining the broader cultural and social factors that enable abuse. For Angie's family, particularly her mother Dania, the loss is permanent and profound. Dania had herself escaped violence by leaving Nicaragua. She had made a new life in the United States and was reunited with her daughter. She had watched Angie work hard, pursue her dreams, send money home to support family. She had seen her daughter get married, and then in an instant, Angie was gone. The grief of a parent losing a child is unimaginable. The grief of losing a child to violence at the hands of someone who claimed to love her adds another layer of pain. Let us end not with the violence, but with the person. Angie Diaz was more than the circumstances of her death. She was a daughter, a sister, a niece, a friend, a co-worker. She was someone who worked 2 jobs to help her family. Someone who pursued fitness and health with dedication. Someone who shared motivational messages on social media, encouraging others to believe in themselves. Someone who graduated high school and dreamed of becoming an accountant. Someone who crossed borders, seeking opportunity. Someone whose smile, according to those who knew her, could light up a room. She was 21 years old. She had survived immigration, adaptation to a new country, the challenges of working multiple jobs while studying and pursuing her passions. She had so much life ahead of her, so many dreams yet to fulfill. The aunt she was helping support in Nicaragua lost not just a niece, but the financial and emotional support Angie provided. Her younger siblings lost their eldest sister, the one who was supposed to lead the way. Her mother lost her child. The community in Waller County, particularly those at Chupé's meat market where Angie worked, lost someone who brought energy and joy to everyday interactions. Customers lost a familiar face. Colleagues lost a friend. The ripples of her death spread far beyond that cabin on Oak Hollow Boulevard. In the aftermath, people created memorials. They held vigils, they contributed to fundraising efforts. They spoke her name. They made sure that Angie Diaz would not be forgotten, would not be reduced to just a crime statistic or a cautionary tale. She was a person, and she mattered. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please know that help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233. They provide support, resources, and connections to local services. No one should have to endure abuse in silence. No one should feel they have nowhere to turn. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to talk about a story that unfolds slowly, deliberately in the quiet spaces between what we know and what we discover. This is the story of Jessie Marie Peterson, a young woman from Sacramento, California, and a year that changed everything for the people who loved her. Let's begin where all stories truly start, with the person at the center of it all. Jessie Marie Peterson was born in 1991 in Sacramento, where the valley heat settles thick in summer and the rivers run cold in winter. She grew up like so many California kids, with sunshine and struggle mixed together, learning early that life could be both beautiful and difficult at the same time. When Jessie was 10 years old, she received a diagnosis that would shape the rest of her life: type 1 diabetes. It's the kind that doesn't come from lifestyle or choice. It simply arrives, uninvited, and stays forever. From that moment on, Jessie's body required constant vigilance, insulin injections, blood sugar monitoring, hospital visits when things went wrong, as they sometimes did. But Jessie wasn't defined by her illness. Those who knew her described her as bubbly, energetic, someone who loved people deeply and freely. She had a gift for connection, for making others feel seen. Her mother, Ginger Kanji, would later say that Jessie loved to share, that she loved her sisters, that she brought light into rooms simply by being there. In high school, at Roseville High, Jessie threw herself into activities. She joined the water polo team, learning to move through water with purpose and strength. She danced, finding rhythm and expression in movement. These weren't the activities of someone who let illness define her boundaries. After graduation, she attended Sierra College in Placer County, continuing her education, continuing to build a life. Life, though, has a way of becoming complicated. As Jessie moved through her 20s, she faced challenges beyond her diabetes. She struggled at times with addiction. She experienced periods of homelessness, those precarious moments when stability slips away and the world becomes uncertain. But through it all, she maintained contact with her family, her mother, her sisters. They were her anchor, her constants, the people who loved her regardless of circumstance. By the time Jessie reached her early 30s, she had been hospitalized approximately 20 times for complications related to her diabetes. She knew Mercy San Juan Medical Center well. The staff knew her. It was a familiar place, a place she'd return to again and again when her body needed help. It couldn't provide for itself. She'd been admitted in January of 2023 for a diabetic episode. She'd had surgery there that same month. This was not a woman unknown to the hospital system, and so when April 6, 2023 arrived, and Jessie found herself experiencing another diabetic episode, it seemed routine. Another admission, another round of treatment, another recovery, and then home again. But this time would be different. This time, everything would go wrong in ways no one could have imagined. April 6th, 2023. A Thursday. Spring settling into Sacramento with its particular quality of light and lengthening days. Jessie Marie Peterson, 31 years old, arrived at Mercy San Juan Medical Center, suffering from a diabetic episode. The admission was documented. Her information was in the system. Her mother, Ginger Kanji, was listed clearly as her next of kin. For 2 days, Jessie remained in the hospital's care, receiving treatment for her condition. And then, on April 8th, at 2:50 in the afternoon, she made a phone call. She called her mother. The conversation was brief but clear. Jessie wanted to leave. She wanted to be picked up. She was ready to go home. Ginger, like any mother who knew her daughter's medical history, urged her to stay. "You're in the best place to get the best care you need," she told Jessie. "You need to stay put." It was the kind of conversation that had probably happened before. The restlessness of hospital stays. The desire to be anywhere but in a medical bed. The tension between wanting to leave and needing to heal. That phone call ended. Jessie stayed at the hospital less than 2 hours later. At 4:27 in the afternoon on April 8th, 2023, Jessie Marie Peterson's heart stopped beating. Cardiopulmonary arrest brought on by diabetic ketoacidosis. Her body pushed too far by the metabolic crisis. Simply gave out. She was pronounced dead. But here's where the story takes its turn into something incomprehensible. So what should have happened next? What any reasonable person would expect to happen next didn't happen at all. Ginger Kanji was not notified. No one from Mercy San Juan Medical Center called to tell a mother that her daughter had died. Not that day. Not the next day. Not the day after that. On April 11th, 3 days after Jessie's death, Ginger called the hospital. She wanted to speak to her daughter. She asked to be transferred to Jessie's room. The person who answered told her there was no one there by that name. Ginger persisted. She had just spoken to Jessie. She had just been there. She spelled out her daughter's name carefully, making sure there was no confusion. And then came the words that would launch a year of searching. A year of not knowing. A year of living in the particular hell of uncertainty. "Your daughter left against medical advice," the hospital staff member told her. She checked herself out. But Jessie hadn't left. Jessie couldn't leave. Jessie was already gone. Imagine, for a moment, what it means to lose someone without knowing they're lost. Ginger Kanji believed her daughter had walked out of that hospital. Impulsive, perhaps. Unwise, certainly. But alive. Out there somewhere in Sacramento. Maybe struggling. Maybe in trouble. But breathing. Existing. So Ginger did what any mother would do. She began to search. First, she filed a missing person report with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office. Jessie's name, her description, her photograph, all entered into the system. The official acknowledgement that someone was gone, that someone needed to be found. She posted flyers around Sacramento, Jesse's face looking out from telephone poles and community boards, asking, "Have you seen this woman?" with a phone number below. She reached out to local homeless communities, knowing that Jesse had experienced homelessness, knowing that word travels through those networks in ways that official channels cannot reach. She got Jesse's information added to the U.S. Department of Justice website for missing persons, casting the net wider, hoping that somewhere someone would recognize her daughter. She checked with the Sacramento County Coroner's Office. That terrible but necessary step, asking if anyone matching Jesse's description had been found. No, they told her. No one by that name. Jesse's sisters joined the search. The family moved through their days carrying the weight of not knowing. Where was Jessie? Was she safe? Was she alive? Every phone call that wasn't her. Every day that passed without word. The particular torture of absence without closure. Meanwhile, less than 2 miles from where Ginger was posting flyers, Jesse's body lay in an off-site cold storage facility that Mercy San Juan Medical Center used for deceased patients. She had been transferred there on April 9, 2023. The day after her death, the paperwork noted her location, shelf number Red 22A, and there she remained, week after week, month after month, while her mother searched, while her sisters called hospitals and shelters, while her face stared out from missing person posters. The hospital said nothing. Spring turned to summer, summer turned to fall, fall turned to winter, winter turned to spring again. A full year passed. During that year, the hospital was legally required to issue a death certificate within 15 hours of Jesse's passing. They didn't. The law required them to notify next of kin promptly. They didn't. State healthcare regulations mandated respect and protection for human remains. Those regulations were ignored. What should have been a tragic but straightforward notification of death became something else entirely. A disappearance. A mystery. A family trapped in the agony of not knowing. And still Jessie remained on shelf number Red 22. Here. Her body slowly decomposing in the cold storage unit, forgotten by the very institution that was supposed to care for her even in death. April 12th, 2024. 1 year and 4 days after Jessie Marie Peterson had died in Mercy San Juan Medical Center. A detective from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office made a phone call to Jessie's family. Not the call they had hoped for, but the call that would finally end a terrible uncertainty. A death certificate had been issued for Jessie. She had been found, she was dead. But the details that emerged made the grief so much worse. Jessie had never left the hospital. She had died there almost exactly a year ago, and her body had been in the hospital's off-site storage facility. The entire time the family had been searching for her. One of Jessie's sisters went immediately to the Sacramento County Coroner's Office, that grim building where the dead wait to be claimed. But Jessie wasn't there. They told her to contact the hospital. Ginger called Mercy San Juan. She spoke to someone who promised to call back. Hours passed with no word. Then a mortuary contacted her. They had been told where to find Jessie's remains. The body was retrieved from the cold storage facility, but what came back was not the daughter, the sister, the woman they remembered, after a full year of decomposition, even in cold storage. Jessie's remains were in such poor condition that an open casket funeral was impossible. The family couldn't even obtain fingerprints as a keepsake. One of those small physical remnants that might have provided some comfort. Perhaps most significantly, the state of her body meant that no autopsy could be performed. No way to determine definitively whether medical malpractice had played any role in her death. The truth of what had happened in those final hours at the hospital, locked away forever in decomposed tissue that could tell no tales. The death certificate, when it was finally completed, told the basic medical facts. Jessie had died on April 8th, 2023 at 4:27 in the afternoon. The cause was cardiopulmonary arrest due to diabetic ketoacidosis. But the certificate had been signed on April 4th, 2024, almost exactly 1 year after Jessie's death, by Dr. Nadim Mukhtar from Mercy San Juan Medical Center. Why the delay? How does a major medical center lose track of a human being for an entire year? How does a hospital tell a mother her daughter left, when her daughter's body is sitting in their storage facility? How does this happen in a system that's supposed to have checks and balances, protocols and procedures, oversight and accountability? These were the questions that Ginger Kanji found herself asking. These were the questions that had no good answers. On August 7th, 2024, Jesse's mother and sisters filed a lawsuit in Sacramento County Superior Court against Mercy San Juan Medical Center and its parent company, Dignity Health. The lawsuit laid out the timeline in painful detail. The admission, the death, the call where they were told she'd left, the year of searching, the discovery, the decomposed remains, the impossible grief compounded by institutional failure. The legal claims were specific: negligence, negligent handling of a corpse, negligent infliction of emotional distress, and violation of California's health and safety code. The family sought $25 million in damages, though no amount of money could truly address what had been lost. But the lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that what happened to Jesse could never happen to anyone else. Because as the case gained attention, as news outlets picked up the story, other people began to come forward. They contacted Mark Greenberg, the family's attorney, with their own stories of loved ones who had died at facilities under the Dignity Health umbrella, whose remains had been mishandled, whose families had been failed. One case stood out. Michael Gray, a man who, like Jesse, had experienced housing instability. He died at Mercy San Juan Medical Center, and his death went unreported for an entire month. His mother, Valerie Gray, had reported him missing in August 2021. A detective eventually tracked him through a credit card purchase at a 7-Eleven. He had collapsed outside, been taken to Dignity, and died, but no one told his family. The pattern suggested something systemic. Not isolated incidents, but a fundamental failure in how the hospital system handled human remains, particularly for vulnerable populations, people experiencing homelessness, people with addiction issues, people on society's margins who in death seemed to matter less than they should have. Mercy San Juan Medical Center, through its parent company Dignity Health, released a statement: "We extend our deepest sympathies to the family during this difficult time. We are unable to comment on pending litigation. Sympathies." The word seemed hollow in the face of such profound failure. Ginger Kanji noted that the hospital had never apologized. Not once. Despite advertising that they treat all people with dignity and respect. Despite the hospital's founding by the Sisters of Mercy, whose very name implied compassion and care, the irony was not lost on anyone. Dignity Health. Mercy Hospital. These names meant something. They carried weight, suggested values, made promises. And in Jesse's case, every one of those promises had been broken. Before we close this story, it's important to remember something. Jessie Marie Peterson was not just a case file, not just a lawsuit, not just a cautionary tale about hospital negligence. She was a person. She loved people. She loved to share. She loved her sisters. These simple statements from her mother paint a picture of someone generous with her affection, someone who found joy in connection, someone who made the people around her feel valued. She played water polo in high school, which means she was strong, competitive, willing to push herself physically even while managing a chronic illness. She danced, which means she understood rhythm and grace, found expression in movement. She attended college. She served as a prosecuting attorney for the Placer County Peer Court, working with young people in the justice system. She wanted to make a difference. Yes, she struggled with addiction, with homelessness, with the grinding difficulty of managing type 1 diabetes while trying to build and maintain a life. But struggle doesn't diminish worth. It doesn't make someone less deserving of dignity, of respect, of basic humanity. When Jessie died at age 31, she left behind people who loved her, a mother who searched for a year, sisters who posted flyers and made calls and checked hospitals and shelters, a family that refused to give up, refused to accept that she was simply gone without explanation. That love, that persistence, that refusal to let Jessie be forgotten is perhaps the most important part of this story. Because in the end, when institutions fail, when systems break down, when bureaucracy loses sight of human beings, it's love that remains. It's family that fights for truth. As of now, the lawsuit continues to wind its way through the legal system. Dignity Health maintains that they cannot comment on pending litigation. The hospital continues to operate. Over 19,000 patients are admitted to Mercy San Juan Medical Center each year. Most of them receive care and leave. Most of them are fine. But how many aren't? How many slip through cracks we don't see? How many vulnerable people, people without strong family advocates, people experiencing homelessness or addiction, end up forgotten in ways we never hear about? These are uncomfortable questions. They force us to confront the gaps between what healthcare systems promise and what they actually deliver, especially to society's most vulnerable members. They force us to ask what dignity really means, what mercy really means, what it means to treat every human being in life and in death as if they matter, as if they're someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone beloved. Jesse's story raises these questions but doesn't answer them. The lawsuit may provide some closure for her family, some measure of justice, some acknowledgement of wrongdoing, or it may not. Legal processes are slow and unpredictable, but one thing is certain: Jessie Marie Peterson existed. She lived, she struggled, she loved, she mattered to the people who knew her. And when she died, she deserved better than to be placed on shelf number red 22A and forgotten while her mother searched Sacramento's streets for a daughter who was already gone. We tell these stories not to sensationalize tragedy, but to bear witness, to say that this happened, that this person mattered, that this failure occurred and should not be allowed to occur again. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we explore a story that reminds us of the fragility of trust, the dangers hidden behind screens, and the devastating consequences of greed. This is the story of Carson Sistrunk, a gentle soul from Mississippi, whose simple desire for connection led him down a path he would never return from. Take a deep breath. Let the tension leave your shoulders as I tell you this story. In the small town of Pearl, Mississippi, nestled in the heart of the Deep South, where everyone knows everyone, there lived a young man named Carson Sistrunk. To understand what happened to Carson, you must first understand who he was. Carson was 24 years old in the late summer of 2022. Those who knew him described him with words like gentle, humble, and kind. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, an impressive height that earned him the ironic nickname Little Man among his friends and family. But despite his towering stature, Carson was anything but intimidating. He had a tender heart, a ready smile, and a laugh that could fill an entire room with warmth. He was raised by his parents, Dale and Darlene Sistrunk, in a loving home where faith and family came first. As a baby, Carson had been dedicated to God, and his parents cherished every moment of the 24 years they were given with their son. Carson had a brother named Clint, and together they shared the kind of bond that only siblings can understand. From the time he could walk, Carson loved the outdoors. Fishing and hunting weren't just hobbies for him. They were passions that connected him to the land, to tradition, to his father. His obituary would later recall how, as soon as he was old enough, young Carson would strap on his holster and guns and head out on his bicycle to hunt. Every March, he and his father would prepare barrels for hand-grabbing fish in May. Carson never hesitated to jump into cold water to set up those barrels, his joy overriding any discomfort. Those who knew Carson described him as someone who loved unconditionally, someone who never judged anyone, someone who was always ready to help. He was a hard worker, employed and reliable. He would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. His best friend would later say at his funeral that Carson wasn't the loudest person in any group, but he had a way about him that drew people in. It was that sweet, tender spirit. He was the best of them. In early September of 2022, Carson was living his life, working his job, spending time with his family, and like many young people of his generation, connecting with others through social media. Snapchat. A simple app where messages disappear, where connections feel temporary and light. It's where Carson met Sierra Jane Insco. Sierra was 20 years old, originally from Nashville, Tennessee. Though she had recently arrived in Mississippi, she and Carson began chatting through the app, exchanging messages, getting to know each other in the way that modern relationships often begin, through screens and typed words and shared photos that vanish after being viewed. They hadn't known each other long, but there was a spark there, or at least Carson thought so. He was looking for connection, maybe adventure. Certainly nothing more complicated than spending time with someone new. To Carson, this was an opportunity to meet someone interesting, to have fun, to see where things might go. But Sierra's intentions were vastly different from Carson's. According to prosecutors who would later examine the case, Sierra had been telling people something very specific in the days and weeks leading up to her meeting with Carson. She had been saying that she was going to have a truck by her birthday, and Carson Sistrunk owned a very nice truck. A silver Ford Raptor with a distinctive dark-colored hood. It was the kind of vehicle that turned heads, the kind that represented freedom and status and value. The prosecutor in the case, Laurel Blue Brinkley, would later describe it this way. This is a case about a young man who met a girl and wanted an adventure. And it turns out that the girl that he thought was fun had a sinister motive. Carson and Sierra made plans to meet in person. It was Labor Day weekend, 2022, September 4th, to be exact. A Sunday, the kind of late summer day in Mississippi where the heat still hangs heavy in the air, where the cicadas sing their endless song, where the world feels slow and peaceful. Carson told his family he was going to meet the woman he'd been talking to on Snapchat. Then he climbed into his silver Ford Raptor and drove away from his home in Pearl. He had no idea that this would be the last time his family would see him alive. Labor Day weekend came and went. By Tuesday, September 6th, Carson's mother, Darlene, was worried. Her son hadn't made contact. He hadn't responded to messages. And most concerning of all, Carson didn't show up for work that Tuesday morning. Darlene Sistrunk knew her son. She knew his habits, his reliability, his nature. Carson wasn't the type to simply disappear without a word. She later told investigators in the television program Snapped, I had a bad gut feeling. I just really started praying and just saying, Carson, where are you? That prayer would go unanswered in the way she hoped. Darlene contacted law enforcement in Rankin County, filing a missing person report. The investigation began immediately. Officers knew that in missing person cases, the first 48 hours are critical. Every moment counts. That Darlene shared a debit card with her son, a common arrangement between parents and adult children. Investigators examined the recent transactions on that card, looking for clues to Carson's whereabouts. What they found was concerning. Carson's last transaction had occurred at a rural convenience store in a town called New Hebron, about 50 miles south of Pearl. New Hebron was not a place Carson typically went. It was a small rural area known to locals for its many oil and gas wells scattered across open farmland. It was remote, quiet, the kind of place where you could be alone for miles. But Carson wasn't alone there. Or at least he hadn't been. Authorities put out an alert for local sheriff's deputies to be on the lookout for Carson's distinctive vehicle, that silver Ford Raptor with the dark hood. They knew finding the truck might be the key to finding Carson. They found the truck on September 6th, Tuesday, just 2 days after Carson had disappeared. It was parked at that same convenience store in New Hebron, where Carson had made his last debit card purchase. But Carson wasn't with the truck. Instead, a woman was behind the wheel. A woman who matched the description of the person Carson had gone to meet. Her name was Sierra Jane Insco, and she was surrounded by onlookers at the convenience store, casually driving Carson's vehicle as if it belonged to her, and she had something else. Something that immediately raised red flags for law enforcement. She had Carson's truck keys in her possession. When questioned by law enforcement, Sierra's story was simple. Too simple. She claimed she didn't know who Carson Sistrunk was. She said she'd recently purchased the truck from another local man, someone she knew only by a nickname. She couldn't provide much detail about this mysterious seller. She said she'd been with a small group of friends on the night of Carson's disappearance, but not with Carson himself. Investigators were immediately suspicious. The story had too many holes, too many convenient gaps. A woman driving a missing man's truck, with his keys, claiming she'd bought it from someone she barely knew, just days after that man vanished. It didn't add up, but Sierra agreed to cooperate. She told investigators she'd take them to a remote location where she claimed to have taken her friends for a night of partying. It was an oil well site, one of the many scattered throughout the area. Law enforcement followed her there, bringing a wrecker with Carson's truck in tow. What they found at that site would change everything. When they arrived at the remote gas well location, it was nighttime. Officers shone their lights across Carson's truck, examining it more carefully than they had been able to do at the convenience store. And that's when they saw it. Teen blood. Frank Riley, a special agent with the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, later described what he observed. He noticed blood on the bottom of the tailgate. Looking closer, he could see remnants of blood inside the truck. In the cracks and crevices, debris scattered in the truck bed. It appeared someone had tried to wash it out with a water hose at some point, but traces remained. Under the truck, on the underside of the bed, and on top of the spare tire, there was a large amount of what appeared to be blood. I knew that something bad had happened to somebody or something, Riley told Snapped. When confronted with the blood, Sierra had an explanation ready. She claimed she'd hit a deer with the truck, but the vehicle's bodywork showed no signs of a collision. No damage that would indicate hitting an animal, especially not an animal large enough to cause that much blood. At this point, investigators had circumstantial evidence, but not enough to charge Sierra with a crime beyond the possession of Carson's vehicle. With Carson still missing and his body not yet found, they had to release her from custody. But they kept watching. They kept investigating, because somewhere out there in the Mississippi darkness, Carson Sistrunk was still missing, and everyone feared what they might eventually find. September 7th, 2022. Wednesday morning. Just 3 days after Carson disappeared, pipeline workers were making their rounds along Golf Camp Road, a gravel road that wound through the oil fields of Jefferson Davis County. These workers knew the area well, knew the landscape, knew what belonged and what didn't. That morning, they noticed something unusual: tire tracks leading off the road into a more remote area. Curious or perhaps concerned, they followed those tracks. What they found would devastate a family and shock a community. The body of a young man, badly decomposed in the late summer Mississippi heat. The victim had been left in this remote location, hidden among the oil wells and farmland where few people ventured. The body was in such poor condition that immediate identification was impossible. It had to be transported to an off-site crime lab for analysis. DNA testing would be necessary to confirm the identity, but investigators already suspected who it was. The autopsy results came back and confirmed the worst. The body was that of Carson Sistrunk, the gentle giant from Pearl who had gone to meet a woman he'd been chatting with on Snapchat. But the autopsy revealed more than just Carson's identity. It revealed how he died. Carson had been shot 3 times with a 9mm firearm. The diagonal trajectory of the wounds indicated that the shooter had been aiming upward toward their targets, suggesting Carson may have been standing or that his killer shot him from a lower position. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a calculated act, not a struggle or accident. Carson Sistrunk, who loved unconditionally and never judged anyone, who would help anyone who needed it, who just wanted to meet someone new and maybe have a little adventure, had been murdered in cold blood. With Carson's body identified and the cause of death determined, law enforcement moved quickly. Surveillance footage from the New Hebron convenience store where Carson had made his last purchase showed him there with Sierra and Sco. The evidence was mounting. A warrant was issued for Sierra's arrest on murder charges. She was taken back into custody, this time not just for questioning, but for allegedly taking Carson's life. During her second round of interrogation, Sierra continued to spin stories. She elaborated on her claim about the mysterious man who had supposedly sold her the truck. She provided more details, but investigators saw through it. They believed she was attempting to fabricate a fictional accomplice, someone to share the blame, someone to take the focus off her own actions. The investigation continued. DNA analysis was performed on the blood found in and on Carson's truck. The results confirmed what investigators suspected. The blood belonged to Carson Sistrunk, but there was more. Clothing that had been recovered from the scene was also tested. The DNA on that clothing belonged to Sierra Insco, placing her definitively at the location where Carson's life ended. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, Sierra was indicted by a Jefferson Davis County grand jury in August of 2023, nearly a year after Carson's murder. She was held without bond at the Rankin County Detention Center, awaiting trial. As the legal process ground forward, people who had known Sierra in the past began to come forward with disturbing stories that painted a picture of a woman with a history of deception and manipulation. Before she arrived in Mississippi, before she met Carson Sistrunk, Sierra Jane Inskoll had been living in northern Florida. And according to people who knew her there, this wasn't the first time she'd been accused of taking advantage of others. A woman named Shelby Taylor told reporters that she'd met Sierra at a country and western bar called 8 Seconds sometime in 2019. Taylor was newly single and had gone out to line dance and meet new people. She remembered Sierra as magnetic, the kind of friend who would pull you onto the dance floor or into other fun situations. "I really thought we could be close," Taylor said. "We have a lot of things in common. We like to hang out at the same places." But that friendship soured when Taylor and other acquaintances learned that Sierra had been lying about significant aspects of her life. She claimed to be a trauma nurse at a Gainesville hospital. She told people she had cancer, garnering sympathy and support. None of it was true. A Mississippi man named Aaron Smith told reporters he'd met Sierra on Facebook earlier in 2022, just months before Carson's murder. They became friends quickly. Sierra told Smith her landlord wasn't giving her time to find a new place, and Smith, being kind-hearted, offered her an extra room in his house for a few days in June. She cooked and cleaned, was as nice as could be, Smith recalled. She claimed to be a licensed practical nurse seeking a job in the area, but that kindness nearly cost Smith dearly. 3 months before Carson's murder, Smith filed a report with the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office, claiming Sierra had taken his vehicle without permission. When Smith heard about Carson's case, he was shocked. "This poor guy lost his life," he said. "It really hit me. It could have been me, but I wasn't thinking of myself. This poor guy just wanted to go out with a girl." Sierra's former stepmother, a woman named Raymond, spoke about Sierra's troubled childhood. She said Sierra's biological mother had walked out on the family when Sierra was very young, simply went to the store one day and never came back. The children didn't hear from her for 9 years. Sierra spent time in foster care in Virginia before eventually moving to Florida to live with relatives and later reuniting with her father. Raymond described Sierra as sweet and seemingly responsible, but also manipulative, someone who could present one face to the world while living a different reality behind the scenes. "As much as I loved that girl like she was my own daughter," Raymond said, "my heart goes out to Carson's family and all the people she's stolen from." The picture that emerged was of a person who had spent years perfecting the art of deception, of using people's kindness and trust against them. Carson Sistrunk wasn't her first victim. He was just the one who paid the ultimate price. As Sierra sat in jail awaiting trial, Carson's family and friends struggled to cope with their loss. At his funeral service at First Pentecostal Church, a reverend compared Carson's fate to the biblical story of Samson and Delilah, saying that just as Samson came with pure motives and genuineness while Delilah came with greed, Carson had walked into a trap. So when she meets and greets Samson at the door, he is there in sincerity. She is there because of greed, the preacher said. In other words, Samson walks into a trap. Carson's family and friends filled social media with tributes and expressions of grief. One relative wrote, "I'll never understand how evil people in this world can be. Carson, you didn't deserve that. No one does." His best friend said at the service that Carson wasn't the loudest in the bunch, but he had that way about him that drew people in. It was that sweet, tender spirit. He was the best of us. Some family members posted claims that Sierra, and possibly others, had forced Carson to withdraw funds from an ATM and sign over his truck title before killing him, though no other suspects were ever charged. The full details of Carson's final hours may never be fully known. Sierra was scheduled for trial, but before that could happen, she made a decision. On July 16th, 2024, nearly 2 years after Carson's murder, Sierra Jane Inskoll appeared before 15th Circuit Court Judge Richelle Lumpkin and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. For the first time since Carson's death, Sierra admitted responsibility. During her plea hearing, she addressed Carson's family directly. Prosecutor Reginald Chip Lewis later described that moment. She gave an allocution that lasted 10 minutes, and I'll never forget. She opened with, "I did it, I'm sorry. I killed him. And that was the first time that anybody had ever heard those words out of her mouth. Judge Lumpkin sentenced Sierra Jane Insco to 40 years in the Mississippi Department of Corrections, with 35 of those years to be served without the possibility of parole or early release. She will be eligible for parole in 2059 when she is 57 years old. District Attorney Hal Kittrell released a statement thanking law enforcement agencies for their work on the case. Thanks to their hard work, we were able to take a violent individual off the streets and show that there are severe consequences for those who do harm to others in Jefferson Davis County, he said. Though nothing can bring Mr. Sistrunk back, it is my sincere hope that his family can find some closure in this resolution. The case of Carson Sistrunk serves as a sobering reminder of the world we now live in, where connections are made with the swipe of a finger, where strangers can enter our lives through screens, where trust is given to people we've never truly met. Carson Sistrunk was not naive. He was not foolish. He was simply human, looking for connection in the way that millions of people do every single day. He couldn't have known that the woman on the other end of those Snapchat messages had been telling people she planned to have a truck by her birthday. He couldn't have known about her history of lies and manipulation. He couldn't have seen the darkness hidden behind friendly messages and the promise of a fun night out. One of the prosecutors on the case said, "I think the lesson to take away from this case would probably be to be very wary about who you place your trust in, especially in the world we live in today, where we can instantly connect with people hundreds of miles away. But this case is about more than just a cautionary tale, about online dating or social media connections. It's about greed, about a person so consumed by desire for material possessions that she was willing to take a human life to get what she wanted. A truck. Sierra Jane Insco murdered Carson Sistrunk for a truck. Carson's mother, Darlene, said something achingly beautiful about her son after his death. Speaking of the 24 wonderful years God gave them with Carson, she said, "So maybe in my mind I want to think God decided he wanted Carson to show him how to hunt and fish in heaven. It's that kind of love, that kind of grace that reminds us what truly matters. Not trucks or material possessions, but the connections we have with others, the love we share, the memories we create." Carson Sistrunk understood that. His killer never did. And so we come to the end of Carson's story. A story that should never have ended the way it did. Somewhere in Mississippi, Carson's family continues to live with their loss, continues to remember the gentle giant who loved fishing and hunting, who would jump into cold water without a thought, who had that sweet, tender spirit that drew people in. His killer sits in a prison cell, with decades ahead of her to reflect on what she did. On that September night in 2022, when she took a young man's life for nothing more than greed and the desire for a vehicle she couldn't afford. The oil fields of Jefferson Davis County remain, quiet and largely empty, the scene of a tragedy that shocked a community and devastated a family. The convenience store in New Hebron still stands. Life goes on as it always does, even in the wake of senseless violence. But Carson is not forgotten. He lives on in the memories of those who loved him, in the stories his family tells, in the lessons we can learn from his death about trust, about caution, about the value of human life. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, I want to tell you about something that's been on my mind. It's about a woman named Zalia. You probably haven't heard of her, but you should have. Her story mattered. So there's this beach in Mauritius called Flick and Flack. Strange name, right? It's on the western side of the island. And if you've never been, imagine the kind of place you see in travel brochures. White sand, water so clear you can see straight through to the coral. Trees bending in the breeze like they're dancing. People go there to forget their problems, to disconnect, to find some version of themselves they lost somewhere along the way. Zelia went there in August of 2024. She was 29. She was a teacher from Russia, from this industrial city in the Urals called Chelyabinsk. Cold winters, tough people, And here she was, finally, on this tropical island, living the dream she'd been planning for months. She posted about catching happiness every day. Actually wrote that. Catching happiness. I think about that phrase a lot now. How she was literally trying to catch it, hold on to it, make it hers. And how close she came. And how it all fell apart in the worst possible way. Look, I need you to understand who Zalia was before we get into the rest of this. Because she wasn't just a headline. She wasn't just another true crime case. She taught at a university back in Chelyabinsk. English, I think, or maybe languages. The kind of teacher students actually remembered, you know? Ones who made class interesting. Who cared? Back in 2014, she got picked to carry the Olympic torch in Sochi. Think about that for a second. Out of everyone, they chose her. There's this photo somewhere of her holding that flame, smiling like she knew she was part of something bigger. That was Zalia, always looking for the next experience, the next adventure. By August 2024, she'd quit her job. Just up and left, she and her friend Elena decided they were going to travel the world properly. Not the 2-week vacation thing where you sprint through a country taking selfies. The real thing. Slow travel, staying in places long enough to actually feel them. They'd rented this little apartment near Flick and Flock Beach. Could hear the ocean from the window. The plan was to spend time in Mauritius, really get to know it, then head to Madagascar on September 1st. Zalia was all over social media, documenting everything. The sunsets, the fishing boats, the endless blue of the Indian Ocean. She seemed genuinely happy, the kind of happy that makes you think, yeah, she's figured something out that the rest of us haven't. But someone else was watching those posts too. Rebellious, for all its beauty, can be lonely for travelers. Sure, you have your travel companion, but there's something appealing about connecting with locals, about seeing a place through the eyes of someone who calls it home. Zalia was using Tinder, the dating app that has become ubiquitous in the modern world. A swipe right, a match, a conversation. So simple, so ordinary. That's how she met Puryavar Singh Sunder. He was also 29 years old, an IT engineer living in Mauritius. In his profile photos, he probably looked friendly enough. Normal enough. He was a local who could show her around, take her to places tourists don't usually see. They began talking. Then they made plans to meet. Looking back now with the awful knowledge of what happened next, it's easy to judge, to say she should have been more careful. But here's the truth. Zalia was doing exactly what millions of people do every single day. She was trying to make a human connection in an unfamiliar place. She wanted to see the island through local eyes. There was no way she could have known what was really happening. Because while Zalia saw this as a casual connection, a way to enhance her travel experience, Puryavar Singh Sunder was building something entirely different in his mind. He was constructing a fantasy. He later told police that he was deeply in love with Zalia, that he was planning to marry her, but they had only just met. This is where the story takes its dark turn. This is where obsession begins to masquerade as love. Saturday, August 17th, 2024. The day began like any other in paradise. The sun rose over the Indian Ocean, casting its golden light across Fleck and Flack. Tourists and locals alike prepared for another day of swimming, sunbathing, exploring. Zalia got dressed that morning in a white and blue dress. Simple, summery, perfect for a day of sightseeing. Puryavar Singh had offered to take her around the island. He would pick her up in his blue Toyota. They would see the sights together. Just a casual day trip. Nothing unusual about that. Elena, Zalia's travel companion, must have watched her leave. Must have said goodbye, expecting to see her friend again that evening, eager to hear about her adventures. There is surveillance footage from that day. Grainy, distant, but clear enough. It shows Zalia walking toward the blue Toyota, her white and blue dress bright against the tropical background. She gets into the car. The door closes. The car pulls away. That footage would later be played over and over by investigators, by news outlets, by anyone trying to understand what happened. It captures the last moments of Zalia's life as a free woman. The last time she smiled, unaware, the last time anyone who loved her would see her alive. Hours passed. Then a day. Elena waited for her friend to return. By Sunday, Elena was worried enough to report Zalia missing. She went to the authorities, explained that her friend had gone out the previous day and never came back. She gave them all the information she had. The man from Tinder, the blue Toyota, the white and blue dress. But then something strange happened. Zalia's relatives back in Russia began receiving messages, text messages, supposedly from Zalia herself. The messages said she had decided to disappear. She wanted to be left alone. "Don't contact me," the messages said. "Don't look for me." Can you imagine receiving those messages? The confusion, the hurt, the disbelief. This wasn't like Zalia at all. She was close to her family, her parents, her brother Timur. They had been following her journey, celebrating her adventures. And now this. Something was very, very wrong. The police investigation intensified. They looked at the surveillance footage again. They identified the blue Toyota. They traced it to its owner, Puryavir Singh Sundur. When the police examined his car, they found blood. Zalia's blood. Under questioning, Sundur's carefully constructed facade began to crack, and finally he confessed. What Puryavir Singh Sundur told the police is almost too terrible to comprehend. He said he had taken Zalia on a tour of the island that Saturday. They had driven through Mauritius's winding roads, past sugarcane plantations, and volcanic mountains. He was showing her his home, or so Zalia thought, but Sundur had something else on his mind. He told investigators that he had learned about his new girlfriend's infidelity. Think about that phrase, new girlfriend. They had known each other for just a short time, yet in his mind, Zalia was already his girlfriend, his property, his to control. And infidelity? What did he think he had discovered? Perhaps Zalia had mentioned she was traveling with Elena. Perhaps she had talked about past relationships. Or maybe even other matches on Tinder. We don't know. But in Sundur's distorted thinking, Zalia had somehow betrayed him, betrayed a relationship that existed only in his imagination. Jealousy, he would later claim. He killed her in a fit of jealous rage. The reality was far more calculated, far more brutal. As they drove through a remote area near La Marie, a residential district away from the tourist beaches, Sundur pulled out a knife. Zalia must have realized then, in that terrible moment, that she was in danger, that the friendly local who had offered to show her around was actually something monstrous. She tried to scream, of course she did. And that's when Sundur cut out her tongue. Let me say that again because it's important to understand the level of violence, of hatred, of control at play here. He cut out her tongue so she couldn't call for help, so she couldn't scream, so no one would come running to save her. Then he stabbed her, multiple times in the chest. The post-mortem examination would later reveal the full extent of her injuries. Her throat had been cut as well. Parts of her body were missing. When Zalia was finally dead, Sundur stripped her naked. He wanted to remove any trace of evidence, any way to identify her. He dug a shallow grave in the woodland near La Marie and buried her body there. Then he drove away in his blue Toyota. Then he sent those text messages to her family, pretending to be Zalia, telling them she wanted to disappear. On Thursday, August 22nd, 2024, 5 days after Zalia had gotten into that blue Toyota, the police found her body. Puryavir Singh Sundur had led them to the grave. Once confronted with the blood evidence in his car, once the walls closed in around him, he confessed and showed them where he had buried her. The grave was shallow, makeshift. In the woodland of La Marie, far from the white sand beaches and turquoise waters that had drawn Zalia to Mauritius in the first place, her body was naked, just as Sundur had left it. Mutilated, multiple stab wounds to her chest, her tongue cut out, parts of her throat missing. The police were still searching for the missing body parts, for her clothing, for the white and blue dress she had been wearing that Saturday morning. The coroner's report would later detail everything, every wound, every violation. The story of what Zalia endured in her final moments. It's almost unbearable to think about. A young woman who came to an island paradise seeking adventure and happiness, meeting instead the worst kind of monster. A woman who loved life, who carried the Olympic torch, who taught university students, who dreamed of traveling the world. reduced to a body in a shallow grave. News of Zalia's murder spread quickly, first in Mauritius, then Russia, then around the world. The story had all the elements that capture public attention. A beautiful young woman, a dating app, a tropical paradise, a violent end. Her family back in Chelyabinsk was devastated. Her mother, Zulfia Shimagulova, a school teacher like her daughter had been. Her father, her brother Timur. They had been receiving those fake text messages, those cruel lies telling them Zaya wanted to be left alone, even as her body lay in that woodland grave. They had believed for a few days at least that maybe she really had decided to disappear. Maybe she was having some kind of crisis. Maybe she needed space. And then came the truth. The worst truth imaginable. A funeral was held in Mauritius before Zalia's body was returned to Russia. The local community, horrified by what had happened in their paradise island, came together to honor this young woman they had never met. This visitor who should have been safe in their home.
Elena, Zalia's travel companion, had to deal with the guilt that so many survivors face. What if she had gone with them that day? What if she had told Zalia not to go? What if she had told Zalia not to go? What if she had reported her missing sooner? Of course, none of it was her fault. But survivor's guilt is a heavy burden.
Puravir Singh Sundar was arrested and charged with murder. He confessed, as I mentioned. He admitted to everything. He told police about the jealousy, about the knife, about cutting out her tongue, about the grave. He showed no remorse in those early interrogations. He talked about being deeply in love with Zalia, about planning to marry her, as if murder could somehow be justified by unrequited feelings, as if his fantasy gave him the right to take her life when she didn't conform to his delusions. It's important, I think, to step back for a moment and try to understand what really happened here, not to excuse it, never to excuse it, but to understand it, because understanding is how we prevent future tragedies. This wasn't really a story about Tinder, although that's how they met. Millions of people use dating apps safely every single day. They meet friends, partners, spouses. They have adventures and connections and experiences. This wasn't really a story about traveling alone as a woman, although that's the angle many news outlets took. Women have the right to travel, to explore, to live their lives without fear. The problem isn't women traveling. The problem is the violence that some men choose to inflict. This was a story about obsession, about entitlement, about a man who believed that a woman owed him something simply because he wanted her, about someone who couldn't distinguish between reality and fantasy, between actual connection and imagined relationship. Paryavir Singh, Sundar met Zalia, and in his mind she became his girlfriend, his future wife, his property, when reality didn't match his fantasy, when Zalia remained an independent person with her own thoughts and plans in life. He couldn't accept it, so he destroyed her. This is the same pattern we see in domestic violence, in stalking cases, in so many instances of violence against women. A man decides that a woman belongs to him, and when she asserts her autonomy, he punishes her for it. The cutting out of her tongue is especially significant, isn't it? He took away her voice, her ability to scream, to call for help, to say no. It was the ultimate act of silencing, of control. In the months following Zalia's murder, the legal system in Mauritius worked to bring Puravir Singh Sundar to justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The blood in his car, his confession, his leading police to the grave. Investigators were still working to determine if there had been any accomplices. Had anyone helped him? Had anyone known what he planned to do? But the evidence suggested this was his crime alone. His obsession, his violence. The case drew attention to the broader issues of violence against women, both in Mauritius and around the world. Dating app safety, the vulnerability of tourists, the warning signs of obsessive behavior. But for Zalia's family, no legal proceeding could bring her back. No punishment for Sundar could undo what had been done. Their daughter, their sister, was gone. Her dreams of traveling to Madagascar, of seeing more of the world, of continuing her career as a teacher, all of it ended in that woodland grave. Her social media posts remain online, if you look for them. Catching happiness every day. She had written for Mauritius, the last happy moments of a life that should have stretched decades into the future. The waves still roll onto Flick and Flack Beach. The sun still sets in brilliant orange and pink over the Indian Ocean. Life continues on that small island paradise, as it does everywhere. But for one young woman who came seeking happiness, that paradise became a grave. Zalia Shemigulova's story is a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind a friendly smile, a dating app match, an offer to show someone around. It's a reminder that obsession is dangerous, that entitlement can be deadly, that we must always be vigilant. But more than that, it's a reminder that Zalia was a real person. She had hopes and dreams and plans. She had people who loved her. She had a future that should have unfolded over decades, not ended in violence after 29 years. Her family flew her body home to Chelyabinsk, back to the Ural Mountains where she had grown up, back to the place where people had watched her carry the Olympic torch. Proud of their daughter who was seeing the world, they buried her there, far from the tropical island where she died. And somewhere, on some server, her social media posts remain. Catching happiness every day, she wrote, just days before she was killed. That's what she was doing. That's all she was trying to do. Catch happiness. Experience life. See the world. She deserved the chance to keep doing that. Rest in peace, Zalia Shamigulova. May your story serve as both a warning and a remembrance. A warning about the dangers that still exist in our world, and a remembrance of a life that burned bright, even if it was extinguished far too soon. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.